rules. If you can keep your cameras off and your mics on mute, then the speakers can speak without any interruption. We will be using the chat function, so please feel free to put questions there at any time. I will try and pick them all up in the discussion portion towards the end after the two presentations, but I'll look at them regularly, and if they're points of clarification or something, I might pick them up earlier. So today's webinar is focused on violence in schools and a systems response. And we have two presenters from Cambridge Education. Emma Sarton will present from lessons from the Girls Education Challenge, and Mathilde Nicolai will present lessons from our work in Sierra Leone, including SSEIP 1 and 2, that's the secondary school education program. And we have in the audience colleagues who've worked with clients like the Education Cannot Wait, worked on our programs in South Sudan and in other countries, and they will be invited to chip in as appropriate. And we are ably chaired by Emily Gray from FCDO. And so I will give Emma and Mathilde a moment to introduce themselves, and then ask Emily to introduce herself and give her opening chair's remarks. I'm Khadija Fancy. I'm the Technical Director of Cambridge Education, and it is my honor to moderate this webinar. So Emma, over to you.
Hi everybody, I'm Emma Sarton and I work for Cambridge Education as a Principal Education Advisor, and I've worked on a number of programmes, but what I'll be talking about today is the Girls Education Challenge, and I'm really happy to see there are still quite a few GEC colleagues in the audience, so please do feel free to chip in if I get something wrong or you want to add to it. Thank you everybody, over to you Mathilde.
Hi everyone. Yes, I'm also working for Cambridge Education as a senior education advisor, and I've worked quite a lot on violence in school, mostly in the DRC and Sierra Leone, and now a little bit in Rwanda.
Thanks, Mathilde. Emily, over to you. You could introduce yourself and then make your opening remarks.
Thanks so much, Khadija, and hi everyone. I'm Emily Gray. I'm a Senior Education Advisor at the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. I've had the privilege to work on 3 of the investments that we will probably be discussing today. So firstly, as we've got a little bit of a no mute issue.
Yeah, I will get, Ellie, could you just check our chat, please?
Yes, checking.
Thank you. Yes, so I've been the FCDO lead for the Girls Education Challenge and later the same for Education Cannot Wait. And that was followed by 2 years in South Sudan as the lead education advisor for our Girls Education South Sudan program there. So I've been around a while and a bit. So thank you to Cambridge Education for their invitation to chair the session today on such a critical issue. We know that violence is very sadly a daily reality for far too many children. 246 million globally experience violence in and around schools every year. And not only is that an obvious violation of their human rights, but it's happening in a place that's supposed to offer safety and severely negatively impacting their performance and attendance. And that's why we have to see this issue of violence as both a protection and a learning problem. We know also that the impacts of violence reach far beyond school-age years, with the World Bank estimating that $11 trillion is lost in lifetime earnings due to violence against children in schools, which is frankly an absolutely staggering statistic. But you are not here today to hear about the stats. I appreciate that these are deeply familiar to most of you and probably underpin the reasons why you care about these issues so deeply. So instead, we'll be focusing today's session on solutions and actionable and sustainable change. What do we know works and how do we identify opportunities to act effectively? And that's both in stable and conflict-affected crises. Violence in school is complex but preventable. At the school level, we know that whole school approaches that engage staff, students and communities and are tailored to local contexts have proven effective. We also know that what happens in schools is sadly indicative of wider systems, power dynamics and cultural norms. So we're moving away from this traditional project-based intervention approach to take a genuine systems level approach. And as I say, that change is happening. And whilst FCDO has been leading in terms of funding and advocacy in this space to date, we recognise that our role is changing at the current inflection point for our sector. The lion's share of resources and power to act lie with domestic governments. We can help build the evidence base, shine a spotlight on the issue, including through better data, and we can support convening, as we did most recently through our co-convening of the Ministerial Task Force on Ending Violence in and Around Schools in May last year. But real transformation will come through local action and leadership, with FCDO and other donors and actors as enablers rather than drivers. The case for action is so clear. Investing in violence prevention comes with estimated returns of £87 for every £1 spent. But perhaps you will agree, even more importantly, it creates safer childhoods and better learning outcomes for children and young people. And these have very obvious ripple effects through their whole lives. But these benefits are only realised if the investments and policy changes that are made are directed towards effective and evidence-based solutions that are genuinely transformative at the systems level. And these need to be backed by robust and sustainable political will. Today's session is about Cambridge Education sharing what they've learned in this space over the years, including in close participation with those of us at FCDO. In holding this session, they're essentially passing the baton, underlining what we know works and pointing the way for where we need to go next. Thank you very much for being here with us, and I look forward to learning with you in the fantastic presentations that are coming up. Back to you, Khadija.
Thanks, Emily. Thanks for that great introduction. So what is it that we're covering in today's webinar? So very briefly, the theme across all of these webinars, and we're holding 6 of them over these couple of months, is system coherence, system strengthening, institutionalization of change. That sort of language is what we're using across it. And violence in and around schools, and working to have effective violence prevention within an education system throws up a number of really critical issues, and it challenges our conceptions of system strengthening, and that's one of the things that we will be exploring. It's a critical outcome for education, as Emily clearly said. It has huge benefits for children's education if we can prevent violence, if we can manage reporting of cases appropriately, if we can learn when violence does happen, to how to prevent it in the future. All of that is really important, but it also drives the education system to not work alone. It forces the education system to work with other systems and to look at its relationship with the communities and the people it works with. This diagram, rough as it may be, is an attempt to show what that feeling is. That child who is a victim of violence is surrounded by human barriers, the shame, the trauma, the fear, and institutional systemic barriers. And finding a pathway through those to protection, to flourishing, back to learning is nigh on impossible if that child is not facing the right kind of support. So a lot of what we're going to talk about today is how we make sense of that mass and make the system work for the child. And one of the things that we as Cambridge Education really try and get across in our learning is that we are not the ones who do this. We look for the drivers of change in the system. That's how we work. And we enable those drivers to make change happen. So briefly mentioned here are some of the changes that we're seeking to effect. And Emma and Matilda will bring out more in their presentations. And then I'll bring this back and we'll recap looking at systems and how systems change at the end of the webinar. So without any further ado, over to you, Emma, for the first presentation.
Hi, everybody. Thank you very much. Before I start, I'm going to sort of well, for those of us on the call who are unaware of kind of the GCE and how it was structured, my example is around the Girls' Education Challenge. And I think it is really pertinent to say that in that programme, it was over 12 years, it was over 800 million, there were 41 projects. They were in 17 different countries. It was a huge, massive investment in reaching the most marginalized girls. And there were two funding windows around reaching girls who had never been to or dropped out of school, and another funding window around trying to support girls already in school but were at risk of dropping out. And on that programme, it was run by a consortium of partners, and Cambridge Education came in the second phase. And this is important because we have PwC, SDD, Tetra Tech, Nathan, a number of partners that were the fund manager. And the reason why that's important is because there's a huge amount of expertise from so many different places that enabled us to really think deeply about how we would address safeguarding and violence in schools. And my role on that programme was to initially was a portfolio advisor, and then looking at the learning and the evidence that was coming out. And then finally, as a team lead, to close the programme. So everything I'm speaking about today is actually off the back of a work of many, many people, but it's been synthesised through the work we did at Cambridge Education and also through that sort of learning and evidence role. And I can see, as I said, there are many people on the call from GDC, so there will be people who can pull me up if I do get it wrong. This first slide really is about the big overarching picture, because it was 12 years, which is a very long time. And I've sort of mapped out perhaps some of the forces that were in play around how we approached safeguarding and violence in schools. So in 2012, safeguarding, of course, existed. But it was, if I compare it to some of the latter years, it was in a more fragmented, more compliance kind of driven way, which didn't always initially match the realities that girls were facing. But projects had policies, and many girls still described fear of corporal punishment and almost no trust in reporting mechanisms. What this early phase taught us is that violence wasn't kind of peripheral. It was shaping whether girls even turned up to school or not. And you will find in a latter slide some learning materials that we produced, and it's evidence clearly in those, where projects found girls feared teachers' punishment and lacked safe pathways to report abusive behaviour. So this meant we couldn't really improve learning without first dealing with the safety environment. And it established a foundation for why safeguarding and addressing violence needed to move beyond a policy and a tick box to actually functioning systems.
Did we lose both Emma and Khadija?
Yep.
They are both in Tanzania. So.
Yes.
Please bear with us, everyone. I'm sure that they'll be trying to dial in as soon as they can. Clearly an internet issue their side.
Sorry, I dropped off. Is everybody else just still there waiting
Yeah.
for me to reappear? Apologies.
Yes.
Okay, let me,
Thanks,
let me
Khadija.
get everything working.
Emma dropped off as well. I think you had
Okay, I
both
think
had
that
a
must have been
connection
something.
issue.
Sorry. We're all in Dar es Salaam at the same hotel. So I think the hotel internet went down. Apologies. Let me get that back up and running. Hopefully Emma will be back as quickly as well. We should probably recruit any of the GEC people in the audience to pick up from where Emma fell off. Hold on one second. Let me see if I can see Emma.
Yes.
Hi, Emma. Yes,
I have
you
no
and I,
idea
you
what
and I.
happened.
Yes,
Oh.
I think everybody knows. Yeah, we're back. We're back.
Okay. All right. Really sorry about that. Both Khadija and I are in Tanzania, so obviously sharing the same internet connection. Where was I? Yes, I was about, so that first bit here, second bit, learning from phase one, it revealed the scale and invisibility of violence, and it showed how kind of damaging weak safeguarding systems can be. And when we dug deeper into it, weak reporting systems meant that silence, not safety, was the norm, and girls didn't report violence because nothing happened when they tried to, or worse, they were blamed for it. So in that first phase, projects did address violence in some way, but the action wasn't consistent across all programs. And so this made us think that it's impossible to ignore violence as a learning constraint. And it led directly to a kind of a donor push and a fund manager discussion around that for greater accountability and systemization across the portfolio of those 41 projects. And moving swiftly on, at this point, that link between learning and school-related gender-based violence, SRGBV, was really, really clear. It was a massive sort of inflection point where violence was repositioned as an education issue, and not just a protection issue. And although this is already known, it became a much greater force and emphasis. And at this point, the fund manager and FCDO, they made SRGBV mandatory. So every project had to address it. And this was a shift. You can't deliver learning outcomes if girls are unsafe. And that's documented in lots of learning pieces that we have. And those interventions led to reductions in girls reporting unsafe journeys in school spaces. More parents began to view school as safe. And it meant that those donor expectations kind of reframing program logic, and to some degree, safety became an input into learning, not a competing issue. And then in 2019, I don't know if Danielle Cornish-Spencer's on the call, but we had she and her team developed the operating model, the safeguarding operating model. And that was a really big shift in how we viewed safeguarding and violence with its minimum standards, action plans, etc. I'll put a link in here if you're interested in finding out further detail about that. But partners began then kind of conducting contextualized risk assessments, and high activities were actually paused until safeguards were in place. So this period, I look at it as terming it as professionalizing safeguarding and SRGBV across that portfolio. And it also created the conditions for rapid, safer adaptation during COVID, which leads me on to the next one in 2020. All of us had a massive shift at that time, and safety and violence became really, really heightened, as in how do we deal with that when we can't even reach people? So for us, it was a real stress test. And I think what could have been a major safeguarding crisis didn't necessarily materialize to the extent that it might have done, because that model I spoke about in 2019 and all the work prior to that had built sort of capacity and capability within all of those programs. And projects adapted quickly with kind of those safe distribution protocols, remote safeguarding messaging and monitoring that kept girls and projects kind of connected. So there was an infrastructure, an ecosystem which already existed that enabled people to check in. And I think actually, when I think about the conversations on the fund manager and with FCDO, there was an awful lot of gained confidence around safeguarding investment paying off in terms of resilience. And it proved that safeguarding kind of wasn't a luxury, not that we thought it was, but it was essential for the continuity of education in emergency contexts. And then moving on beyond that, violence prevention and safeguarding were no longer kind of standalone work streams. They were integral to what we call our GESI architecture. And I know Michelle Sander-Lewis is on the call, and she was a huge architect of that gender education and social inclusion framework. And it made explicit links between gender norms, power, exclusion, and violence. And this is where safeguarding became more intersectional and system-wide. And having that GESI framework, and again, I'll post some links into that. It was aligned with the FCDO at the time, Women and Girls strategy, and anchor safeguarding with inclusion and power dynamics. And that was a really important shift. So programs recorded reduced parental perception of schools as unsafe, girls reported feeling more confident about reporting harmful behaviour, and national governments began adopting elements of the models that programs are using, codes of conduct, referral protocols, etc. So things became way more embedded, and it cemented, I think at this time also, the kind of GEC's role as a sector leader in violence prevention and GESI-aligned safeguarding. Those models have gone far and wide into different resource hubs and programs. So, you know, when we treat violence as peripheral, we get peripheral results. And when we treat it as core to learning, then actually we see systems functioning and things change in terms of accountability, trust, ultimately outcomes for girls. So if you move on to the next slide, this model that I've been talking about, I'm not going to spend too long on it, but briefly, that's in a sort of a graphic form. This was a real driver of change. You know, the safeguarding model also included a specific focus on SRGBV, and it's important because it had sector-wide impacts through the intention to have a multiplied impact. And that multiplied impact you can see on the screen, but it was around projects reporting, you know, as a result of aligning their policies and practices with the kind of the GEC kind of framework and model here. They've been replicated in their organisations and with other programmes. There have been inputs into kind of national system levels with policies and implementation of that, referral pathways. There are lots of examples, and I'll share a document that details those if you're interested. And just to move on really quickly, trying to catch up some dead time that we had. This slide is showing you some of the learning briefs and bits and pieces I was talking about. The one on the right there, protection is possible. That's the one that details all the operational model. And the three below are, you know, learning briefs. What we found out that did or didn't work around trying to end violence in schools, in emergency crisis situations, and also the GESI framework. So if we turn our attention to the projects, I have 6 main reflections. So what shifted outcomes on violence in schools under GEC wasn't a single intervention. It was a system level change in how violence was understood, prioritised and acted on. And when I say systems, I'm talking about those which lie in the kind of the donor fund manager space in countries at different levels of the system and NGO implementing partner space. So number one would be violence was reframed as a core constraint on learning, as I've just mentioned. It wasn't an add-on. I think, you know, violence was addressed inconsistently to begin with. Like I said, about half the projects were looking at in phase 1, but it changed because that evidence we had told us something very uncomfortable. The girls were actually, you know, not feeling safe. They were afraid, particularly of corporal punishment, and they didn't know how to report or didn't trust that it would lead anywhere. That changed by phase 2, and that shift mattered because, as I said, all of a sudden it became a precondition for learning. The second one was about progress coming from combining system levers, not isolated activities. This second reflection is more about the move that projects made away from single interventions. And when we see it across the programmes, we see that projects are more effective when they worked across 3 kind of connected levers. You can see there in figure 1, you know, strengthening reporting response systems, making school and communities safer, and supporting girls' awareness, voice and agency. The projects that combined these 3 approaches, they saw consistent improvements, you know, fewer girls feeling unsafe, fewer parents perceiving schools as unsafe, and reductions in corporal punishment. What's important here is that not every project did everything, but the violence was tackled within that system. Even where projects focused mainly on teacher practice, for example, we saw immediate reductions in corporal punishment because they were intervening at a leverage point in the system. The third reflection is that policy does matter, but only when it's made to work. Another key turning point for lots of projects was how they engaged with policy. In many countries in the GEC, national SRGBV policies did actually already exist, but often they were poorly disseminated, thin on implementation detail, or not well understood on a district or school level. So stronger projects didn't just stop at that policy endorsement, they worked with ministries to translate it into practical guidance, and that was around clarifying reporting pathways, you know, defining roles and responsibilities, supporting dissemination and building capacity to actually respond to cases. That work didn't always look very dramatic, but it was really, really critical because it shifted SRGB from something that existed on paper to, as I said at the beginning, there's something that was functional. And it may have been uneven, but it was increasingly within the system itself. I think, reporting systems that improve when functionality became the focus. You know, I think that learning brief there, the orange one, is very clear on what didn't work. You know, suggestion boxes on their own, helplines that depend entirely on project staff, or assuming that referral committees function just because they existed. Where these reporting systems improved, it was because projects focused on functionality and trust. So there were multiple ways to report, including anonymously, female safeguarding focal points in schools, survivor-centered referral pathways, and critically, kind of case conferencing across sectors, not just within education. An example from Nepal, the Marginalised No More programme, it combined complaint mechanisms, counselling desks and elected safeguarding focal points. And that combination made reporting more accessible and more credible. You know, the idea here is that the reporting mechanism is only as strong as the response that it can actually trigger. And then fifthly, teacher violence was addressed as a system practice issue. And that was really important shift about how teacher perpetrated violence was handled. Projects that simply told teachers to stop using corporal punishment didn't succeed. What did work was treating violence as a practice embedded in training systems and school norms. So the really effective projects integrated positive discipline into teacher professional development, gave teachers practical alternatives for classroom management, and created space for that kind of critical reflection on power, gender, and their own experience of discipline. You know, we had good results with that in Ghana, caning reduced around a quarter. In Somalia, the Somjet T project reduced observed corporal punishment from over half of classrooms to virtually zero. And lastly, you know, what's striking is that these gains don't come from kind of addressing punishment per se, but for professionalizing non-violent practice. And I think that was really, really key. And lastly, you know, girls' voices become part of system accountability. There was a shift in how girls were positioned, where girls were supported to articulate their experiences through mapping or scorecards or structured dialogue. Systems became more responsive. There was a program in Zimbabwe, a very good example of that. Girls developed scorecards based on their own concerns and presented them to school and community stakeholders. Reporting increased, not because violence rose, but because silence reduced. And the SRGB brief is, you can see here, it's very clear that girls' voices are most effective when backed by trusted adults and male champions. You know, participation on its own is not enough. It had to be relational and supported. So I think, you know, just for me to close now, because I know we're running out of time, you know, it's not just technical. It is conceptual and institutional. Progress happens when violence is linked to a learning issue. Responses are working across policy, schools and communities. And systems are made to function, not just to exist. And most importantly, girls' lived realities inform that decision making. So thanks, Khadija.
Thanks, Emma. I mean, just incredible richness coming out of GEC. And I think that was always the intention of FCDO in funding in this big way into girls' education, was to draw out that learning. And so huge kudos to the GEC team. And I know many of them are online who contributed to that. I will move on to Sierra Leone and we can unpick some of the things that you raised in the discussion later, but there's a really great connection between the GEC story and the Sierra Leone story, which is that I don't know if anyone from IRC is online, but the IRC GEC program in Sierra Leone was a core component of some of the really interesting information that we were able to use in Sierra Leone to strengthen the referral mechanisms writ large. And that their ability to do that was funded through the GEC, and then it was relayed on. So there's connections here that happen maybe unintentionally even. So over to Mathilde.
Thanks, Khadija. And we can go to the next slide. So I'm presenting on SSCIP, the SSCIP project in Sierra Leone, which is better known as Lewilan, Let Us Learn in English. Project was really long because it had two phases, started in 2017 and will close in December 26. And it's really a key example of a project which was allowed to pivot quite drastically towards focusing on school safety because it was needed, because there was evidence in country that violence was at a very critical level in schools, etc. So the objectives varied across time. At the very beginning, it was about getting the education system back on its feet after the Ebola crisis and focusing on learning. But very rapidly, there was a growing concern about school safety and violence. And well, started by school visits from the World Bank and some research uncovering very worrying levels of violence occurring in schools. And Le Whelan could pivot his work to focus much more on preventing and responding to violence in response to this and in response to the emerging political will on the topic. And we could do that because FCDO, the donor, allowed it, and because we always, as Cambridge Education, try to really work with and through the national system. So we were always really focusing on technical assistance and supporting the system at central and at district level for whatever they would need, basically. So it was really a very system strengthening kind of project, and it became much more so in the second phase. So first of all, you can see on the slide, it's been a journey. It takes truly time to introduce changes into institutional routines and behaviors, especially on such a taboo topic as violence, and to ensure these changes are truly owned by actors. So we started in 2017 with some research, some studies, continued with some policy work and supporting national communication campaigns. Around 2020, 2024, we got a major policy approved, the National Referral Protocol, which I'll refer to a bit later. And it all culminated somehow in May 2025, and Emily, you mentioned it, with the current Minister of Education being the co-chair of the International Task Force to End School Violence with FCDO. Quite a major achievement, and with some processes really embedded into the systems and sustained over time, well, hopefully without working in silos. So and we really believe that working with the system, so mainly Ministry of Education, but really this work extended to many other ministries and to the government and to the whole ecosystem, really, local actors, etc. We really thought this was the only way that these processes and these mechanisms would be sustainable in the long run and owned by national actors at all levels. So if you can go to the next slide, Khadija, please. It was all about seizing opportunities and creating space for school safety. We tried to do it through many different ways, not one by one, but really trying to tackle all these aspects at the same time to really create momentum and open space for change on violence in school in Sierra Leone. First, using research and evidence to draw attention and to provide much needed data. There wasn't a lot of data beforehand. So we've done learning assessment and school safety studies. We've done annual knowledge, attitudes and practices surveys to really show progress over time. And we've done a lot of qualitative research, which is, I think, often lacking on perceptions around violence from students, from teachers, from parents, etc. The insights from this research, confirmed that violence was really widespread, that it affected both girls and boys, and that perpetrators were other students, but very often school staff as well, which is not uncommon. And it also uncovered that the major barriers to ending this or to reducing violence in school was the lack of confidentiality whenever something was reported, the fear of retaliation of the survivors, and also the lack of sanctions for the perpetrators. So we learned from this research to try to apply it and find solutions with the ministries. We disseminated this research widely, and we used it to advocate for change at all levels. And this created space for discussion for an issue which wasn't discussed a lot maybe before, or maybe not too much, maybe more at national level and less at district level, and very not so at school level, for example. We were also able to pivot rapidly to take advantage of an increased political will. The First Lady created a Hands Off for Girls campaign a few years back, which was a really turning point, I think. We had a Minister of Education a few years back as well, who was really interested and focused on radical inclusion for a range of reasons, but this really shed light on the issue and on exclusion of vulnerable groups in general, and on violence. So we've been supporting all of this. We've been supporting the communication campaigns and providing technical assistance and working with the government and with the entire ecosystem on this. We benefited in Sierra Leone from a very rich ecosystem of actors who are willing to work on the subject. UN agencies, other donors who are funding it, including the World Bank, but not just them, and a very active network of service providers and partners, so local NGOs, rainbow centers, etc. And we managed to work together, and I think that made a difference to shift the needle a little bit and to open space for this issue. We worked extensively with the Ministry of Education and government on policies and procedures. We know they're needed, that they're the first step. They should exist, even though they're not sufficient if they're not implemented, of course. So we worked on a teacher's code of conduct. We worked on a radical inclusion policy, and finally on a national referral protocol. The national referral protocol was quite key because it's cross-cutting. It's way outside of the education system. It sets out how governmental and non-governmental entities support the process of reporting and responding to cases of GBV. And it really guides the coordination of ministries, departments, agencies, frontline service providers. Very new because it put in touch very small NGOs, very small local providers with the police, health, education, social ministries, etc. We lost Khadija again, so I'll share the slides.
Are you okay to keep going, Mathilde? And
yeah,
we can imagine the slides until they come back.
Yeah, true. You don't really need the slides actually. Yeah. And then we really focused on the latest years to moving towards national ownership, so embedding violence prevention into institutional routines and processes. So we worked with the Ministry of Education to introduce school safety committees, which are, school structures made of school staff, requiring no budget to be sustained, but who are able to act on any case of violence that is reported to them and escalate it, if need be, to the district level. And we also work with the Teacher Service Commission to address one of the main barriers, which was the lack of sanction when the perpetrator was a school staff. So we worked with them on a reporting and sanction mechanism, which is now operational. So you have the district ministry staff who can escalate the cases, and the national level who is taking administrative sanctions with or without the justice system, which can last longer, or maybe sometimes it's not involved, but at least the teacher gets their pay suspended, they can get expelled, and this wasn't happening before, so there was total impunity on this. And we saw great behavior change through the knowledge, attitude, and practice studies over time. Emma said that in some cases, you see the percentage of cases reported increase, but because the silence reduces. It was the case in Sierra Leone as well, but you can really clearly see that students and teachers know much better what's okay, what's not okay, what's acceptable and not, and how they can react to it and fend for their rights. So in conclusion, I think this showed great progress over a period of 9 years. We have to acknowledge that it took time, and it was also thanks to the donor, to FCDO, who was flexible enough to let us focus very much on this issue when it wasn't planned at the very, very beginning. And we relied on a huge political will, even in a not so strong national system, which doesn't have a lot of budget to dedicate to this, but we could build on this ecosystem, which was really willing to work on this. Then what will the future look like with budget reductions and Ministry of Education, which doesn't have a lot of money to sustain things that need budget? Some of these things don't, but some do. That's a question, and I hope we'll explore it in the discussion.
Khadija and Emma, do we have you back yet?
Yes, I am just moving to a better place. I'm sorry, the internet keeps dropping in this hotel. So just bear with me 1 second. Okay, I'm moving nearer to the source, the router, I believe. So apologies, everybody. And I'm not sure where Khadija is.
Thanks, Emma. So Mathilda has very kindly gone through her presentation without the slides, so extra props to her for that. So I think we're back to you and Khadija, or next is Khadija's presentation, but let us know how you'd like to keep going.
Okay, so sorry, Matilda, why don't we move on to the question that Khadija was going to ask us? And that question was around kind of what happens when we silo violence as a separate agenda, and what does a genuinely integrated approach require? That was the question. Would you like me to go first, Matilda? Yep.
Yeah.
So I think, again, from a GEC perspective, and I'm thinking around sort of those different levels of systems and ecosystems that we have, you know, I think when violence is siloed, I think one of the main things that happens is that we underestimate the scale and nature of harm. And I think, you know, if I think back to kind of the GEC, girls, you know, frequently reported their fears around unsafe environments, even in projects that had initially looked quite good on the safeguarding kind of protocols that we had. And I think, you know, reporting systems were either absent or kind of deeply mistrusted, as I said before, meaning that violence remains kind of invisible, therefore unaddressed. So that was the biggest thing I think happened. I think another thing that I would pick on there around the negative impacts of the siloing is that fragmented interventions produce those sort of fragmented results. I said it before, if it's on the periphery, then your results will be on the periphery. So, you know, when it's fragmented, the result is predictable. Violence still exists. Girls' attendance and participation continues to be constrained. And the safeguarding quality, you know, varies kind of dramatically. I think, you know, not only within programs, but within differences between schools. And I think another sort of element, there are two more, I think, as a result of siloing, is that policy existence is sometimes mistaken for kind of system functionality. I'm really sorry there's a lot of noise in the background here. And that's patterned by gender norms, it's shaped by power, it's intensified by exclusion. I know we have, as I said, Alicia and Michelle on the call, we had many conversations about how do we make those systems function better, given the issues around power and exclusion. And I think, you know, the most effective SRGB interventions like those in the brief, they combine those things, those safer school environments, behavior change, community accountability, survivor-centered systems. And I think the last one, when we silo it, we get kind of we want systems that actually work for girls. So that a real shift documented across the files is to move from do you have a policy to does the girl sitting in the classroom have a working pathway to report and get support? If we have that siloing, we don't have that. It's just a form there. So yeah, integration requires systems that are used, trusted, and capable of responding. So that would be my answer to that. Mathilda, how about yourself in terms of when we silo violence as a separate agenda?
Yeah, I think first of all, we know that, but we don't always do it. I think safety and well-being must be seen as a condition for learning. So in a way, you know, focusing on learning while knowing that safety of children is not guaranteed is, in my opinion, pretty much useless. But we still have projects which, by requirement, but because their scope of work is like this, separate it and just focus on learning. Focusing on learning in an environment where children have absolutely no guarantee they will be safe throughout the day, probably will have absolutely no effect, and there is a lot of, you know, academic research to back this up now. So I wanted to mention the example of the work we've done with Education Cannot Wait in Eastern DRC. So Education Cannot Wait had a first multi-year resilience program in one province and wanted to renew it but really focusing on some of the eastern provinces in a conflict-affected situation, like you probably all know. Very, very dire conditions with numbers of sexual violence towards children, which is, you know, skyrocketing currently, especially in North Kivu and South Kivu. And the multi-year resilience projects usually focus on access and learning, right? That's the core work of an education project. But on this case, we were able to make the case that not focusing on school safety and not focusing on children's well-being was not an option in such a context. So we worked very closely with the education cluster, of course, but also with the protection cluster and the gender-based violence sub-working groups. So the whole like humanitarian ecosystem outside of the education system to find out solutions which were, yes, not purely health or not purely protection, because it wasn't our mandate, or it's not ECW's mandate, but that considered it and were able to work with these actors in the whole system. So the multi-resilience program that we ended up with for Eastern DRC has a huge component on school safety and a huge component on psychosocial support and well-being. And actually that means less money for learning and less money focusing on teacher training, etc. Because right now it's not the priority. The priority is to keep these children safe throughout the day. And I think it was a big win to make this accept to the government of DRC, to ECW, because they also have their education priorities. I'm not sure some of them are in the call today, but if they are, please jump in. I think it was just a big win for children overall to take into account these specific challenges in this specific context and to detach the program from a purely education program, which would not have gone very far.
Okay, thank you, Mathilde. I think it would be really interesting to hear from some of our other colleagues in the chat, especially those. Is Daniel online from South Sudan? You know, I think one of the questions we have here is around how humanitarian systems and development systems handle violence differently and what they can kind of learn from each other. I know Michelle is online and she wrote the kind of the learning brief on kind of fragile conflict affected spaces on the GEC. Michelle, it'd be great if you had some comment around that. You know, how do humanitarian systems, development systems handle violence differently? And is there anything to learn from each other around that? I know I'm slightly winging it here because I was not the moderator, but I do have the questions in front of me. Who's on the chat? Michelle, are you there? Can't actually see anybody. I'm so sorry. There's actually a question, maybe directed towards you, Mathilde, while we're waiting for Khadija to come back, from Michelle Dong in the meeting chat. So I wonder if there's a reference material for what was just shared in the ECW case.
By what do you mean by reference material? There is the MURF, so the...
Will you ask Michelle to unmute? Would you like to ask your question, Michelle?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much. No, I think I completely agree with a lot of the what was shared. And indeed, you know, in terms of connecting to learning outcomes, etc., I think this is really foundational because otherwise, you know, we'll be speaking to the same group and not kind of like getting this more embedded into programming. And indeed, like in terms of cases where whether it's in conflict zones or, you know, hard to reach areas, like these cases are even more important and foundational to learning and access. But at the same time, it's often, the kind of argument you have is that, well, in the first place, there's not much resources and therefore we cannot do this, But in fact, it's where it's most important. So I wanted to know if you had some reference materials in terms of whether it's an evaluation document, a synthesis of study, or etc. that can be easily shared, because I think what you referred to is very much on the implementation side of things, and the fact that it would not have happened without this. So yeah, I think that's where my question was coming from. Thank you.
So there is the program online. I can find the link and sharing. So the Military Resilience Program is just starting though. So my reflection was really more on the design of the program. Then we need to see how it's implemented. But then I think there is a lot of resources we could use on making it clear that focusing on learning without focusing on children's well-being and safety first is not like, doesn't position children in, doesn't put children in a position to learn efficiently. I can try to find some reference materials on that.
Thank you.
Mathilde, do you have any reflections about that question around the humanitarian development spaces and thinking about, do they handle violence differently, and is there something they can learn from each other, or what is that connection?
Yeah, I mean, I can start, but I'm sure other people will have good reflections as well. I think potentially the humanitarian and development systems are kind of merging, or should be kind of merging, because there are so many more protracted crises now, and because essentially it's the same issue, not at the same level of severity probably. Actually, in the DRC, we argued that DRC is I don't like the word, but it's considered to be a fragile state. Always has some provinces which are in a conflict affected, and we see in these places when the humanitarian sector works completely separate from the national system, from government. Well, it's useful for the children they reach at the moment, but it's never sustained and never owned by national actors. In a few years back, there was this quite big conflict in the Kasai province, and we put a lot of efforts as a government support, as a project which was really a technical assistance to the government. We put a lot of efforts on coordinating these humanitarian actors and making sure they connect with the provincial officials. And that actually made quite a big difference in terms of planning and budgeting, because instead of doing everything, in siloed and separate and sometimes overlapping, of course, there was a clear plan for the province on where do you rebuild schools, where do you put, temporary learning spaces, where do you provide materials, and it helped the province and the government to manage this better. I also think it's linked with our overarching theme, which is about system coherence. Very often when we have these separate projects, they try to tackle one or two issues, corporal punishment, etc. But they can't, and they don't have the means to tackle the broader issues, which, for example, if you think about transactional sex in schools, which is very widespread, we have evidence on so many countries, but it's linked with poverty, it's linked with inequality. It's not something an education project, a purely education project, can solve. It needs this dialogue with the whole system, with the, all the sectors. It needs dialogue with social sectors, with health sectors, etc. And I feel it's sometimes harder to do in humanitarian settings because these projects are shorter, they're time consuming, and they're linked to specific activities, whereas we sometimes had, not always, but sometimes we're able to take a step back and look at the broader picture like we did on Sierra Leone, for example, for the National Referral Protocol.
No, thank you very much for that reflection, because I think it chimes quite a lot with that the learning brief I was talking about earlier about the Girls' Education Challenge and the responding to kind of those fragile conflict situations. It was really, really important. And I think, you know, I know I have colleagues on the call, but I think one thing we were discussing is about how violence is handled in fundamentally different ways in those two different kind of contexts. And I think one thing that was interesting on the GCA, because of the length of time, we weathered quite a few changes in the situations in some countries. We have projects in Afghanistan, we have projects in Ethiopia, all sorts of places where either drought or conflict was a real issue in terms of the programming. So there was a pivot towards some of those humanitarian spaces. And I think one thing that we can sort of reflect on that is that although in each acute crisis, humanitarian system prioritized kind of immediate protection, and in development it was longer term. But I think when we have flexibility around how we can pivot budget lines, how we can pivot what we're doing, I think that's really, really important, because one often is the development space is often a wee bit slower and the humanitarian comes in much, much quicker. But I think they both have something to learn from each other about using local actors, getting those systems that already exist and supporting those that will still remain thereafter that kind of humanitarian conflict. And I think, you know, the kind of adaptability, contextual risk analysis and flexible delivery models are really important. And the GEC projects varied. You know, they did things like class schedules around migration. They used radio and paper learning where movement was unsafe. They prioritized psychosocial kind of well-being when academic progress was impossible. And they had a genuinely integrated approach that accepted some of those more challenging environments around protecting girls and keeping them learning. They knew was sort of inseparable. But I think that was afforded because of the work prior to that. Those connections, relationships were already known. So there's something there about understanding those ecosystems and tapping into them, not just having that sort of really, really immediate response without understanding that. That's in a perfect world, but I think that's one area of moving forward. I know Khadija is back online because she's sat next to me in the hotel lobby now. So I do apologize for all this jumping around. I think, Khadija, if you want to take over, we've looked at the last question and now it's about sort of maybe Q&A from the audience, but also that last question we had about what can we take forward?
Yeah, indeed. So again, huge apologies. I was running around the hotel trying to find internet. So Emma and I sat in the reception. So apologies if there's any background noise. So I don't know what you managed to cover in the questions, obviously, but I wanted to pick up on a couple of things and I wanted to throw it out to the wider audience as well. I thought there were a couple of things that both of you said in your presentations that it's really important to touch on and then hear more from you about how that ended up working. So on both presentations, there was a real emphasis on the need to look at the full spectrum of actions needed to make change happen. And I think this is a really interesting issue, and I think violence really forces us to look at how to change behaviors in a really deep way. And so the behaviors of teachers, the behaviors of girls, the behaviors of parents, the behaviors of institutional actors, education actors, you really have to work, and I've heard you talking about working to get girls to trust systems to make reports, for example. That's a behavior change. To talk about holding teachers accountable for their behaviors or for how they handle reports when they come in. Again, that's a behavior change. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about behavior change to address violence, to accept the fact that violence happens, to manage reports, to respond to reports, to make reports in these sort of quite fundamental areas where people need to change their behaviors in response to maybe potentially quite threatening, personally threatening or challenging issues laden with taboo and stigma, like gender-based violence. So I throw that back to both of you, and if anybody on the call wanted to talk a little bit about that, I thought that would be a helpful dimension to draw out. Mathilde, did you want to touch on that in terms of
Sure.
the work that you did? Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, no, I think behavior change, I think we need to recognize, and everybody really needs to recognize that when it takes time, it's much harder than, surface activities like training or community awareness raising. We know it's just barely the first step, but to actually get to changing behaviors and changing practices, it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of commitment, and it takes, like you said, Khadija, a broad range of actions. I wouldn't say activities, I don't like this word, but broad range of actions. So maybe evidence, maybe actions that build confidence of children, actions that build respect of the reporting system, or maybe respect not the right word, but if there's no consequences, there will be no changes. That's very clear. And very often there's no consequences when the perpetrators are adults or powerful people. And school staff are powerful people in this context. So accountability is built through these things like transparency in how cases are handled, getting children to trust the processes, and this takes a whole broad range of things. Having people they can trust in the schools. In Sierra Leone, we used teacher mentors, voluntary teachers who were usually younger, but not always, usually closer to children, and who were willing to take on this role. This was quite key, apparently, to be like the trusted adults around the school. And clearly working on the sanction system and making sure it's working, that was a huge game changer, because survivors could see something happens when they report. And I think that was a big driver of behavior change. And just getting knowledge about what's okay, not okay, and what their resources are.
Oh, that's a really good point. I mean, you have to build trust in a system through the system actually responding and showing that it actually cares about the issues that you're talking about, which, also links, Emma, to the point that you made about the importance of girls' voices, which is also a behavioral change issue, that girls willing to speak out, their voices need to be acted on and valued in order for them to continue to do that, including reporting, but also taking a chance at putting out their concerns for schools to change.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. I think one thing that we often talked about on GEC was, I suppose, ceiling effects, if you like. You can have we work with girls a lot around kind of their confidence and self-esteem to speak up. But actually, if they do and it doesn't go anywhere, that's really, really damaging. And we spent a long time with all the programs, all the 41 programs on the GEC, thinking about, so how do we get girls to transition through this whole kind of process, and which other actors are really important to be able to alleviate that blockage or that ceiling effect of, yes, I'm now confident, but you're not actually going to increase your confidence unless you feel confident in the system and the referral pathways that exist to you. And there was always with the different actors in different parts of the system, that comment I made around teachers, not coming into teachers saying, this is bad, you're doing this bad. It's a case of, this is the positive pedagogical discipline route, if you like. Those kind of conversations made much bigger difference than trying to stop things per se because they were bad per se. I'm not suggesting they're not, but I think it's a different way of approaching it. And it's the same with parents. We spent a long time working with programs, also thinking about how do we interact with parents. Lots of programs have this is my own personal opinion now, but this kind of sensitization training, which it sometimes really misses the point, because it's not that parents don't want to send their children to school, they just believe it's not safe. So you're coming from a slightly different, far more positive standpoint. If you're saying, okay, so this is the case, how do we make this safe? And we had so many examples of parents and communities that actually formed safe journeys for their children, boys and girls, to get to school. And they took that on, and they are still carrying that on, because it wasn't going in saying, you're not sending your kid to school, off you go. It was actually saying, okay, so what is the issue here? There was so much mapping around those barriers that involved working with communities and girls' voices to do that. And it was every single part of that picture. But that does take a long time, and it takes a certain kind of attitude to kind of what you want to achieve in the time frame you want to achieve it, plus all of the other kind of accountability and compliance issues around managing a large program like GEC, with the very necessary structures around the reporting and the case management. So I feel that we shifted on many levels to do that.
And an attitude towards the people that you're working with and for, you know, that their voices are valid, that their opinions are valid, that you know, parents do value education, and that their fear of safety is a valid fear that should be treated as a programmatic goal as well. I know Marie has put a comment in, and I was actually going to invite Marie and Tawanda if you wanted to come off mute and share, because the Girls Education Program in South Sudan has done a huge amount of work on safety for very obvious reasons. And it's not just a girls' education program. It has been working with children with disabilities and been very effective in that space. So I don't know, Marie or Tawanda, if you wanted to come and share a little bit about the experience on working on safety in South Sudan.
It's not only me, Tawanda. It's and I see Agnieszka has also joined.
Oh, good.
Yes. Perhaps I'll put my camera on too.
Please.
You know, disability, right, for many years we've realized that they are doubly vulnerable. And when we introduced this huge, I mean, you know, reaching to 2.4 million children with the cash transfers, where you actually hand out funds to children in their hands, goals, that raised a huge safeguarding issue. Not to talk about all the bullying, discrimination, and violence towards girls with disabilities. So our program was so multifaceted, and we worked with media, you know, BBC Media in Action, with the relentless radio programming, you know, community listening groups, using solar radios in remote areas to speak to parents, involving whole communities to buy into the safeguarding and of children and getting them to school in a safe way, you know. So and I think Agnieszka can speak about the wonderful work and the impact of the work of the mentoring assistants, because she did so wonderfully on that. I'll leave it to her and to Wanda to take up from what I'm saying.
Thanks, Marie. Thanks so much. And thank you for bringing that to mention. Is it's really important not to forget that intersectionality, that where multiple different forms of exclusion or vulnerability overlap, you get even more of a risk of violence. Agnieszka, Tawanda, if you wanted to add anything, I'll give you a couple of minutes, and then I'm going to start to bring us back together. Tawanda?
Yeah, maybe I could jump in before.
Yeah, please.
Yes, thank you. So I think because South Sudan is generally considered as a fragile sort of economy where violence, you know, permeates across all levels, from family level up to society level, and it is taken as a norm in every other situation. But nonetheless, as a program, we decided to have a starting point by working jointly with the Ministry of Education. So we developed what we call a co-owned safeguarding strategy. And of course, with the FCDO in support, the whole idea was to get started, at least to manage and to control safeguarding at school level. So we developed a strategy together with the ministry, which when issues were being brought up by the learners, for instance, if the perpetrators were school administrators and so forth, were violating the Teachers' Code of Conduct, it is easy for the ministry then to take relevant action. And as and when we were working with schools, just like what Maria said, we developed a safeguarding, a toll-free safeguarding hotline, which allows a learner to, to report to the JES program anonymously if she didn't want her identity to be known, or she could have register her name if she perceived that she was safe enough to be able to do that. So basically, the Ministry of Education and the JES program has started, working, making a start on safeguarding, and also ensuring that when we participate in meetings on the national education cluster, safeguarding becomes a topical issue with responding to the refugee situation, people coming from Sudan and other locations. I think let me leave Agnieszka to talk about the mentoring program, because it has also been helpful in supporting safeguarding of learners.
Thank you. I think for the for the mentoring program, what was special about it was the fact that we've engaged graduates of secondary schools, girls, who were trained as mentors for other girls and boys who were in schools, and they became the face of the program in those schools where we had those mentors engaging with students. And through the mentoring assistants, that's how we called them, the mentoring assistants, through the mentoring assistants, we received quite a lot of feedback from students on what is happening in schools, how they are being treated, what is happening at community level, and what challenges learners are facing. And then through mentoring assistance, we were able to also derive some strategies to manage some of those cases. So I think, probably one strategy that really worked for us is the fact that those were teenagers or very young adults who were working with other teenagers or very young adults. Thanks.
I think that goes back to the core issue of that trust and that willingness to engage people where they are, and to, accept people's opinions about what issues matter to them. And so thank you, Agnieszka. Thank you, Tawanda. And I think, that experience of working with young women is core to a lot of things, and I know a lot of education programs have done it. I know CAMFED has, made a real inroad into showing the importance of young women's leadership. And that's something that is core to this. And I think that gives me an opening to sort of get back to our sort of system strengthening. I want to recognize Jake's point as well on boys and men. It's absolutely central that we work with boys and men in violence prevention work. And we don't have time to go into it fully, but I know that Emma mentioned it, and I know that there's other learnings, and we will write and share various learnings coming out of our work. So we might make a point of drawing that out. Jake, thanks for drawing our attention to it. I'm going to bring us back to looking at this from a systems perspective. What is the systems coherence that we're looking at? If you've joined the last couple of webinars, you've seen this wheel before. Our colleague Dan Waisel presented it in the first webinar rather, looking at coherence across the various disciplines or areas of work that are needed in order to deliver a system-wide safety response. And so that one was on learning. This one I've translated for safety. You can see that you're looking at, and all of our presenters and speakers today have mentioned it: community engagement, teacher training, reporting mechanisms, leadership, finance, school quality assurance, data collection. Mathilde spoke so eloquently about the need for different kinds of data, where the data gaps are, qualitative data. So this sort of depth is really necessary. But I think our discussion on violence challenges even this system coherence framework. And if I may challenge our own framework, I would say that when we're looking at education, you have to go even deeper. We're looking at going from the child all the way up to the policymaker, all the way up to the donor. And we can't stay within the education system. We can't stop at the classroom. We have to break through to the community and to the family and to the child herself or himself. And we also have to break out of the education system. The services needed when you're reporting violence, when you're dealing with a case of violence, require the justice system, the child welfare system, the health system, and many others. And so you need to develop an ecosystem of partners with multiple different government systems, multiple different agencies and organizations working in communities, working in and around schools. That wider ecosystem suddenly becomes really important, and you see the need for the education system to relate to other systems. And as we've just been talking about, you need to look at services and coordination, but you need to go all the way down to looking at attitudes, behaviors, and power. So our system coherence becomes a much wider ecosystem coherence and a much broader understanding of the kinds of barriers that we're looking at, all the way from interpersonal, relational barriers, power-related barriers, to gaps in services and systems. So much broader issues are raised when you look at the prism of system strengthening, a look at system strengthening through the prism of violence prevention. So I hope that's been helpful. I'm going to hand back to Emily to close for us. And if you have any other questions, please feel free to put them in the chat and we'll pick up on them later. And a recording will be available as always. And again, please accept my apologies. I was running around like a chicken with my head cut off, but I hope you were able to continue apace without me. So apologies for the break in the webinar. Over to you, Emily.
Thanks so much, Khadija. I'm very glad that you do actually still have your head. We need it. As I said at the start, we know the stats, but violence prevention is still not broadly being mainstreamed. And sometimes we're seeing it actively dropped from the agenda because it's felt to be too hard. But I think the positive messages from today's presentations are that we do know how to work at the systems level for genuine transformation. Some of the things that stood out to me today were the violence prevention mainstreaming in the GEC projects, and that's such a broad portfolio of projects in so many different contexts. And that recognition and consensus that violence is a core learning issue and not something separate. And I don't think that has been the norm necessarily in the past, but I hope that the sector is converging around that as something that is held as a norm now. This issue around safeguarding as well as being critical for education continuity, especially in conflict settings. And my thanks to colleagues from South Sudan and the JESS projects for coming in to share their experience, which is so valuable. They're doing some really cutting edge work there. Other things that stood out, this discussion in terms of policy only matters when it works. And I think all of us have experienced in the past where great policy has been written and then effectively sat on a shelf. So that being one part of the puzzle, but far from the whole picture. And how do we get it off the shelf and into action, and not just at the national level, but right down to the school level, and supporting those who have to enact it with the skills that they need to make that happen. Another element was this issue of reducing silence. So girls' voices being backed by adults, including champions, and not just expecting girls to speak up alone. We know that these issues are part of the power dynamics that girls in particular, but other marginalized learners are living through. So we can't expect them to just speak up and feel okay with that. So what support are we putting in with them as well? And this point that it takes time to introduce changes, so especially on what is a bit of a taboo subject in some contexts like violence. But hopefully we've shown positively today that we're not starting from zero, and a huge amount of work has already been done and the evidence base continues to grow. And then finally, this issue of national champions. So I was really struck, Mathilde, by your Hands Up for Girls example in Sierra Leone, and the ministers and others who came in behind that, who understand and want to champion this issue. It's so critical to have that support as well. A final thing I just want to say before we finish up, I'm really conscious that these webinars are happening because obviously Cambridge Education is closing, and there will be such a loss to the sector. And I know many of us are feeling that keenly. But we need to make sure that we're taking the learning that they are sharing and taking it forward in the sector, and that we're focusing on these systemic, locally owned and contextually relevant solutions that we are being pointed to, and we know that the evidence is strong behind. So hopefully, in amongst the challenging statistics and that things take time and the difficulties we face, especially in conflict and protracted crisis settings, there is some hope there, and that these learnings have been useful to you today in your various contexts as well. So thank you very much for joining us, and especially to those who've shared their own expertise as part of the discussion. And again, thank you for bearing with us with the technical issues, but as you know, that's the reality of the settings that we work in. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Emily. Thank you so much for closing. Thank you. Thank you all for joining.
Thanks all.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.